Chapter 11. Ramsay. The sky was the deep blue of a sapphire as the magpie's wings sluiced across the waves, surrounded by a veritable armada of merfolk who darted and danced around and under her hull. The lower decks were filled with their strange, keening wail that Mercia assured the others was harmless. She imagined it must have made the ship look like a mother whale surrounded by its young, although the mood aboard was rather tenser than the playful scene might have suggested. Rathbone naturally demanded that she and Ramsay finally sit down and supply them with some explanation of everything to which he and Shan had been unwitting accomplices in the last few days. Ramsay refused to linger on detail and insisted that they get underway at once. Rathbone also wanted to raid the remains of Douglas's hideout for anything that might have survived the cave-in and could fetch a pretty penny. Any gang of pirates that size surely hoarded some valuable treasures, he insisted, until Mercia reminded him that at least 2 of the objects had been cursed in some way. The prospect of winding up with a petrified arm of his own seemed to have quietened him, at least for now. Their destination was distant, and Ramsay wasn't sure how slowly they would have to travel, lest they risk leaving the merfolk behind. As it turned out, they needn't have worried. They left the island at a crawl, with but a single sail unfurled, and their new companions surged ahead of them almost immediately, flipping and waving. "Is that the best you can do?" they seemed to say. And they increased their speed until the magpie's wing was sailing along at a tidy clip. Only when the horizon was free of both land and ship alike did Ramsay allow the others to go below as he kept watch at the helm, giving Mercia a chance to explain the truth behind their journey. No sooner had the 3 sat themselves around the map table than Rathbone demanded to know all about their destination and what their reward might be, given that they'd risked life and limb to free the prisoners. Shan, by contrast, was rather more interested in the merfolk themselves and how it was that they'd come to ally themselves with the crew of the Magpie's wing. Mercia decided to start at the beginning. The very beginning, in fact, explaining how Ramsay had become taken with the idea of somehow possessing, or at least controlling, the magic that seemed to permeate the Sea of Thieves. How the ransacking of their hideout had made him eager to find any kind of trick, some advantage over anyone else who might seek to steal from him or challenge his authority. She told them of the many fruitless hours she'd spent in taverns listening to prattle and nonsense before finally stumbling upon the old woman, and of the real reason for her trip down into the shipwreck. Finally savoring the thrill of a good story, she explained in great detail their descent into the network of underwater passages. She was gratified to see their eyes widen as she described the grand hall that lay forgotten under the waves. "It was when I put the earrings on that everything suddenly became so clear," she finished. "Like when you remember a dream." "I don't dream," Rathbone said curtly. "So you can understand that racket they're making out there, then? What are they saying? Nothing about what we might taste like, I hope?" "Their song is about, well, anything and everything." Mercia shrugged. "I know that doesn't make sense, but it's their identity, it's their art. It's what they did 1,000 years ago and will do tomorrow, all carried on the music. It's not like they can write anything down after all." "Interesting," Shan mused. "If it's anything as powerful as whale song, They must be able to talk to each other across huge distances. Could be a useful way of sending messages. Rathbone rolled his eyes. You two make quite a team, one of you pulling the world apart so that the other can patch it back together again. So you put the earrings in. What happened next? Mercia took a deep draught of water as she considered how to arrange the story in her mind. Only when the last of the drops had passed her lips did she rest her chin thoughtfully on her fist and begin to speak. Ramsay's hand, Mercia told them, went to the hilt of his sword when the water in the chamber's central pool began to churn. Though she herself was far too enraptured to pay much attention to his actions. Her mind was filled with a sudden understanding that threatened to overwhelm her, and it was all she could do to stay on her feet. That changed when the first of the figures erupted from the water with a great splash that soaked the floor in every direction, for the song had reduced to a muted, wordless hum. It was as if the singers themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. The two pirates had found themselves staring at what they both knew had to be a mermaid. A living, breathing mermaid of the kind that Mercia had read about in storybooks when she was a child, now floating serenely before them and studying them much as they were studying her. Her large eyes, sparkling with both interest and intellect, were the color of fossilized amber. Her skin wasn't blue, lavender, or silver. Rather, it was some shimmering combination that seemed to shift and swirl from moment to moment like oil on water. Her slender face, with its strong jaw, was framed by a mass of pale green hair, tied sensibly back into a delicate ponytail that seemed braided to intertwine with the flowing fabric that wreathed much of her body. After a moment, two more mer broke the surface of the water to float slightly behind her, though they performed nothing as ostentatious as a backflip. Mercia guessed correctly that the two pirates were looking at some kind of leader or nobility. A mermaid queen, perhaps. Ramsay had evidently been thinking the same thing, for much to Mercia's surprise, he took a step forward, removed his hat with a great sweeping gesture, and bowed as low as his great frame could allow. It was a gesture that seemed to please the merfolk, for their song started up again, not a chorus this time, but a single voice calling out from the darkness. Mercia had no way of knowing if the words she was hearing belonged somehow to the mermaid in front of them, but a lone singer was far easier to understand, and after a few seconds her face split into a broad smile. Yes, I can. Ramsay looked at her in confusion then, and she attempted rather clumsily to explain that the merfolk were trying to communicate with them, with her. Not through speech as humans understood it, but by changing the meaning and tone of the song, one that they seemed to sing at all times and that seemed to unite them no matter how far apart they were. To begin with, the song had been filled with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. The merfolk were unsurprisingly aware of the many humans who had recently come to the Sea of Thieves. They used a strange and complicated word to refer to anyone who dwelled on land, a word that Mercia first tried to translate to sand swimmer, then two-tail, before she finally gave up. What Ramsay and the others saw as discovery, however, the merfolk viewed as a homecoming. They expected to be met in the old ways of their people, and were surprised and a little alarmed when the humans not only seemed unfamiliar with the merfolk, but also had begun warring with one another. They think we're the same as the people who built this place, Mercia explained to Ramsay finally. Or at least that we're somehow their descendants. They expected us to remember them. No wonder they've been so wary of us until now. It took some time, but Mercia managed to explain to the merfolk that she and everyone else who sailed above had come from far away, where the idea of a sea-dwelling people was considered nothing more than a myth. Their song took on a mournful tone at this point, though when she expressed a desire to learn all about the Mer and the ancient inhabitants of the Sea of Thieves, the sadness was replaced by a wistful refrain. She sat cross-legged on the floor and listened, Ramsay standing patiently behind her. Long ago, she learned, what humans now thought of as the Sea of Thieves had been home to a nameless people whose civilization flourished and thrived. There were ships back then too, and even a few pirates. There were also artisans and sculptors, philosophers and painters, men and women who the Mer had no name for, but whose understanding of the world around them had led them to harness great power. It was while describing this power that Mercia had first reluctantly used the term magic for herself. There were special places in the world, it seemed, certain spots where magic would manifest itself in a variety of ways. The ancient humans marked these special locations not with words, which could be forgotten, but with paintings on the rocks and stones, whose meaning would endure beyond any written language. Across the centuries, temples and altars were created at these special locations to harness the power and gain some understanding of its potential. Eventually, that understanding grew into reverence, and reverence led to ritual. The temples became sacred ground. Over time, this ancient people was able to channel this magical power well enough to imbue the objects and belongings they had created with special properties. Through their knowledge and efforts, all kinds of strange and magnificent artifacts were brought into being. Some granted great boons to whoever possessed them, such as an unnatural long life or an ability to withstand burning heat. Other artifacts, most often ones that the owner wished to protect, were imbued with terrible curses that could freeze the soul to ice, or worse, if they were removed from their resting places. Mercia had been unable to translate a lot of what the song had to say about the dark nature of these curses, for which she was privately grateful. As the people up above worked to master magic, so too did they strive to cultivate a relationship with the Mer below. Using their wisdom and their craft, they took the purest pearls and transformed them into magical earrings with which they might hear the merfolk song and be understood in kind. They constructed great undersea chambers to act as meeting places, pointing the way with more of the eye-catching paintings, and the two civilizations began to live in harmony. While both races were largely content to leave one another in peace, they would occasionally have reason to cooperate. The Mer would uncover precious stones and gems in the very deepest part of the ocean that the humans seemed to value, and it was but a little effort for them to be excavated and taken up to one of the meeting places as a gift. In return, the humans would use their weapons and their magic to help the merfolk deal with the problems they faced below the waves, like Old Mother or the Whispering Plague. It had seemed like a union that could last forever, and yet, here the song filled with sorrow, the merfolk's song had begun to go unanswered. Jewels left in the chambers went unclaimed. The shadows of ships passed overhead no longer, and the merfolk had no understanding as to why. Saddened and concerned, they gathered together great search parties of their strongest and fastest, intending to swim beyond the boundaries of their kingdom in search of their land-dwelling friends. Those who returned spoke sadly of a choking mist and poisoned ocean that they had encountered far beyond the waters they called home, forcing them to retreat. Perhaps the humans had managed to brave the fog somehow and sail to the lands beyond, but there was no way to know for sure. Anguished by the loss of their friends, the merfolk kept the memories of those above alive within their song. They took earrings and scattered them across the land in deep caves and rock pools, where they would be safe, and one day a human might stumble upon them. More years passed, and eventually they became accustomed to being alone.
"They told you all that in a song?" Rathbone said skeptically. "No wonder you were away so long."
"Well, they were excited to see us," Mercia said defensively. "As I said, they had no real clue of what humans get up to on land. No idea how long we live, or that we have to try to pass on what we've learned to our children as best we can. They have their song after all. It was hard to get them to understand the idea of forgetting something or not knowing what others of your kind are up to."
"Well, at least now we know what happened to Douglas," Shan said thoughtfully. "Their curses, I mean. The idea that any random treasure you find could turn you into a pigeon or make your legs drop off is enough to turn a man honest."
Rathbone snorted.
"Huh. Speaking of that oversized oaf."
Mercia nodded. "That was the next thing we learned, yes. When we first arrived in the Sea of Thieves, the merfolk caught wind of us soon after we made it through the Devil's Shroud. That's the poisoned water they mentioned. They all swarmed to the ancient meeting places and waited for us to arrive, which of course we never did. So they started following us, keeping their distance for the most part, but a couple of them got too curious.
"And decided to pop out of the water and say hello to Douglas and his men," Rathbone concluded, "who not only couldn't understand them, but didn't see them as anything other than a sea monster to be paraded around back home. So they got themselves captured instead, idiots."
"Those idiots, as you call them, would have had every right to take Ramsay and I hostage in retaliation," Mercia said hotly. "As far as they knew, all pirates are one and the same. They asked for our help anyway. They knew where the two mer that had been captured had been taken, but they rarely go far inland unless they have to."
"And so you agreed to rescue them?"
Rathbone sighed.
"Tell me that Ramsay with his bleeding heart remembered that we're pirates, not philanthropists, and has now commanded them to lead us to the hoard of long-lost treasure and jewels we so richly deserve. After all, they are in our debt."
"It seems to me," Shan said slowly, "that there's a lot more that these merfolk can do for us than offer up another chest full of gold pieces just to fritter away in the pub. If what Mercia says is true, and they never forget anything on account of their song, that means they must know the location of sunken shipwrecks and more of those old temples, not to mention places we want to be avoiding so we don't end up cursed ourselves." "You're both right," Mercia said diplomatically. "Although," she paused, tipping her head this way and that as she listened to the singing that surrounded them. "Come on," she said, standing suddenly and slapping her palms onto the table. "We're here." They could sense the change in the air as soon as they made their way above deck. This region of the Sea of Thieves was a dour and gloomy place that Shan had heard referred to as the Wilds, and it was easy to see why. The islands here were a far cry from the gently curving beaches and lush greenery of Thieves' Haven, with straggling vegetation clinging to cruel, rough-hewn rocks that jutted out of the water at odd angles and made sailing treacherous. The air smelled of sulphur and the water below them was cloudy and discolored as it reflected the murky sky. The breeze felt like a musky, fetid breath on their skin as they took in their surroundings. Almost at once, they spotted their destination. It would have been hard to miss. The view ahead was filled with enormous bones, monstrous in their scale, and yet unmistakable as anything other than the remains of some great creature. When it was alive, however long ago that must have been, it would have been larger than any outpost. The magpie's wing under Ramsay's command was already sailing smoothly down what remained of its ribcage with room to spare. Even though he knew it was an irrational fear, Rathbone couldn't help but feel uneasy. Every pirate had heard legends of those ships that had been swallowed up by enormous whales or other similarly massive sea creatures. Now here they were in the belly of the beast, or at least where its belly used to be. What was this thing? He breathed, not daring to speak too loudly. "Old Mother," Ramsay called, cheerfully, not the least bit intimidated by the macabre surroundings. In fact, he rather seemed to be enjoying himself, adjusting course so that their ship emerged from between two bones and began to trace a route alongside the behemoth's skull. The top part of the skull jutted sharply out of the water, and an immense eye socket stared at them accusingly as they sailed past. "Funny," said Shan. "That's almost what I'd have called it. Mercia mentioned that name just now. Was she something to do with the merfolk?" Ramsay nodded. "It used to eat them. Quite a lot of them, from the sounds of it. Waking up every century or so to feed and then settling back down to sleep again. Of course they tried to fight it. But what good's a blade gonna do against the hide of a beast like this?" "Eventually, the merfolk went to the humans and begged them for help," Mercia continued, gesturing over the deck at the swimmers. There was no frolicking or playing around now. The water-borne figures all looked deadly serious as they moved in pairs through the remains. But not even the most powerful magical weapons would have been enough to deal a mortal blow to Old Mother, even if you could get close enough. Instead, the humans forged great chains to bind her and place a curse on them. The links could never be broken, and the locks could never get picked. 1,000 years could pass, and you'd never see a single speck of rust. They snuck up to Old Mother while she slept on this very spot. Ramsay cut in, swinging the ship around so that they could take in the view. And they ran the chains around her body and through her tentacles, looping them through all the caverns and caves they could find down below. Chained her up good and proper, so she could never chase 'em down again. They say it took another 100 years before she stopped thrashing about, and every night her roars would shake the sea. When she finally died, her young left her and went their separate ways, heading out to every corner of the sea. "Young?" Rathbone snorted. "Say the word, Ramsay. I doubt there's anything left I'm not prepared to believe today." "Krakens, then," Ramsay said mildly. "Well, Old Mother's feasting days are over now, and that's why we're here." He rested his hands on the wheel and took a deep breath, as if the words he was searching for had to be dredged up from deep inside him. Maybe it was wishful thinking to believe the Sea of Thieves would be ours forever. Or maybe it's better that it's not. It's a place that pirates were destined to find. There's adventure and plunder enough for all of us here, enough to last a lifetime, and we shouldn't need to steal from each other. But if that's the way it's gonna be, if there's gonna be a pecking order, then I'm the one who's gonna be doing the pecking. Leaving the wheel to spin idly,
Ramsay strode past the others and placed one gloved hand upon the capstan. The ones who used to live here learned how to make magic work for them, and I reckon I can too. That starts today. With a flourish, he allowed the anchor of the magpie's wing to drop, bringing them to an abrupt halt. As Shan and Mercia moved to furl the sails, there was a sudden commotion all around them, a splashing and crashing so tumultuous that the ship rocked back and forth slightly. The merfolk were diving now, forming neat formations that darted into the watery deep with a sleek efficiency that presented a stark contrast to their earlier playfulness. Far below, they could see the silvery figures rushing this way and that. After a few moments, with his mouth moving silently, Shan worked out why they'd come all this way. "They're unchaining old mother," he said slowly. "It's the chains, isn't it? That's what you're after. That's why we came all the way out here. Iron that never ages, and locks that can't be broken." Ramsay grinned at him, then hauled himself onto the ship's ladder and down toward the water's edge. As the others watched in bewilderment, a procession of merfolk made its way toward him, each handling a length of silvery metal that looked as shiny and newly forged now as it had when it was made all those years before. Grasping a few links in his hand, Ramsay hefted himself back up the ladder with a grunt of effort until he was back aboard, at which point he began to haul. "Don't just stand there, you lot," he snapped, and together they began to heave more of the cursed metal aboard. Finally, with the magpie's wing now noticeably lower in the water, they stood around great coils of hastily piled chain, all of which was still icy cold from the centuries it had spent beneath the waves. Looking heartily satisfied with his unusual cargo, Ramsay moved to the prow of the ship and gave another solemn bow to the waiting merfolk, who were now arranged respectfully behind their leader. At once the song began anew, though only Mercia could discern the words, and even she was uncertain as to its meaning. "The bonds of old agreement have been raised on high, and though we swim from shadow of our debt, our hearts sing at the reunion with a joyful cry. Your kin we shall continue to abet." And that seemed to be the end of it, for a deafening series of splashes marked dozens of figures diving back into the water and making for friendlier seas. Within moments, the merfolk's song had faded into the distance, and the crew was alone once more. "Locks and chains," Rathbone said, dully, his voice hollow as he broke the sudden silence. "All this work for locks and chains." He turned, as if sleepwalking, moving stiffly and sightlessly, and went below decks without a word. "We are sure they're really unbreakable, aren't we?" Mercia asked. "I mean, I know they chained up an entire kraken, but are we sure that the magic hasn't, I don't know, faded or something?" "They look fine enough, but we won't know for sure until we get back to Thieves' Haven and I can get them nice and hot on the forge," said Shan thoughtfully. "I can already think of a few uses, though, as long as I can reshape the metal. I mean, the wing's anchor." "No," said Ramsay forcefully. "You'll have your chance to tinker, Shan, but I've got plans for this little lot. By the time we're finished, no pirate will ever be able to steal from us again." With the heavy chains stowed in Ramsay's cabin for safekeeping, as no one particularly wanted to drag them down all the way to the hold, the Magpie's wing set sail with her most unique plunder yet. The ship cast a long shadow over the ancient bones as it sped across the waves,
the sound of a celebratory shanty washing around what was left of the ancient beast. There was a merry tune, and it carried down to the deepest, darkest crevices in the seabed, where a lone form, lurking in old Mother's shadow, had woken. The merfolk had disturbed the slumber of ages, and now one wrathful golden eye, milky and crusted with barnacles, watched the little ship keenly as it moved away. The sound of the music, the scent of the wood in the water, and the heat of the bodies were considered carefully. All were remembered. There had been too much time spent sleeping to give chase just yet, but the ship would not be forgotten. Smaller prey would do for now, and then, once its strength had returned. Down in the blackness, the one-eyed form began to stir.